A Theology of Christian Counseling by J. Adams. Chapter 7. Counseling in the Trinity, the Doctrine of God Continued. From time to time in various books I have spoken about discipleship. I have contended with discipleship is the proper method for training counselors, counselees, or anyone else because it is the biblical method. I have set it over against the academic method, which we adopted from Greek Academy, as fuller, different, biblical, and therefore the more effective method. I have seen Christian education in general, from kindergarten through seminary, suffering from failure to understand the basic elements of and rationale for the discipleship method, and the lack of concern to develop this method of instruction at all levels. I have conferred with educators about this and find interest and sympathy. But in my opinion, there is yet no breakthrough for the traditional, institutionalized approach to a more biblical one. If it is going to happen, now is the opportunity, perhaps in counseling and among counseling instructors in particular, especially since nouthetic counselors have been and are currently trained through this method. There can be even greater progress that may spill over into the other areas of Christian education. What is the discipleship method? Fundamentally, teaching by discipleship is the with him method. When Jesus chose his disciples, it does not say that he chose them to attend his lectures, though sometimes they did just that, but rather to be with him, Mark 3:14. What does this imply? Why were the disciples to spend time with Jesus? In Luke 6:40, where Jesus explains his philosophy of education, the answer to those questions becomes clear. He says that a student, when properly trained, will be like his teacher. That is a startling statement to the modern-day educators who would never think of such a goal. But why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they think of themselves merely as verbal deliverers of information rather than embodiers of it? Notice, Jesus does not say that good teaching will help the student to think like his teacher. Of course, that is part of what he has in mind, but there is more. He will be like his teacher. In this distinction lies the basic difference, in goals and purpose, between the academic and discipleship methods of education. The one who becomes like his teacher thinks like him. It is true, but he will come to resemble him in other ways as well, in attitudes, in skills, in incorporation of values and skills in everyday living, etc. A whole person will affect whole person on all levels. That is the goal of discipleship training. Does it work? Acts 4:13 completes the picture. Those that Jesus chose to be with him, that they might become like him, were so changed by that method that at length they were recognized by others as having been with Jesus. The same can be said to be true of those whose discipleship training at CCEF in Christian counseling has enabled them to learn counseling. There is a style among such counselors not so stereotyped that it defaces their own gifts and personalities, but that it is recognizable. Now, much can be said about teaching by discipleship. Here's another place for study and fruitful writing. But in summary fashion, let me list some of the salient features. 1. The disciple is apprenticed as a son by his father. Jesus spoke of discipleship in a father-son context in John's Gospel. There is therefore something different from the cold, impersonal conditions so common to academic contexts. In discipleship, the focus is not merely on content, but even more so upon the disciple himself, and the disciple in all dimensions. 2. The disciple hears what his teacher has to say about the subject taught, as in the academic method, but also what he says about it in actual practice. Moreover, the disciple hears what he has to say about many other things, and begins to hear how the discipler relates this information to the other data and how he uses it in life. 3. The disciple also sees the thing taught done by the teacher himself. He becomes a model not merely of someone talking about his subject, but of someone vitally engaged in pursuing it. Idealism of the classroom, often self-deceiving to the academic teacher who talks about but rarely, if ever, does the thing discussed, is soon washed out by viewing the practical application of theory in action. 5. The disciple may ask questions about what he observes as well as about what he hears. Not only will more questions arise as a result of observation, but the character of the question will change from purely academic, often nitpicking and unrealistic, to a more vital and realistic one. 5. The disciple learns to do the thing taught under the teacher's observation and supervision. Nothing can substitute for this. Too much is left for trial and error on the academic model, where years of floundering by the student could have been prevented by a very few hours of such how-to discipling. These 5 facts are not exhaustive, but they are all important. Serious reflection on them, drawing out their implications, will show you how much difference there really is. Now, why have I raised this issue here, under the doctrine of the Trinity, you may ask? A good question. But first, let me have one more word with you before responding to that important inquiry. The issue of how to teach is crucial to all biblical counselors who by definition are involved in the ministry of the Word. That ministry, by the nature of the case, requires teaching. Counselors themselves are taught and being taught. The teaching programs that they frequent ought to employ the discipleship method and should demand it. You cannot learn counseling well through the purely academic approach. Counselors must teach elders, deacons, and other key laymen how to counsel, so they too must understand and develop the discipleship method. Moreover, in counseling itself, instruction is vital. All sorts of data must be taught to counselors and in a practical, concrete, life-changing way. Discipleship is important for this. I have taken up this issue because teaching methodology is not optional. Biblically, it is wrong to teach in the abstract. All teaching is for life. It involves commitment to God. Therefore, truth incarnated in life is the goal. For reaching this goal, only one method is possible, the biblical one, discipleship. Whole persons must teach whole persons. The Word must be made flesh. Discipleship isn't one option. It is an imperative. It is the only option. Because we have failed to see this, Christian education on all levels is suffering. This is an almost total commitment on the part of the Christian educators to the academic approach. Educators pride themselves on high academic standards and in accordance with the development a professional attitude about their work that more often than not turns out to be cold and impersonal. If anything should characterize Christian education, it ought to be a warm, familial approach to learning. But it doesn't. Many Christians, along with their pagan counterparts, soon develop the attitude that student is the enemy. Among Christian educators, too often, there is almost total ignorance of the discipleship model and its excellencies. But why take up the discipleship here under this head? Because discipleship takes its impetus from the Trinity. The method is not to be adopted rather than the academic approach for pragmatic or arbitrary reasons. Rather, it is to be preferred because it is of its intratrinitarian basis. There is a theological imperative for teaching by discipleship. The Gospel of John most fully expounds the theological relationship between the Father and the Son that forms the basis for teaching by discipleship that ought to be undergird all levels of Christian education, including counseling. In John 8:26-38, Jesus says, among other things, that he does nothing on his own, Rather, he speaks what he has heard the Father speak and does what he has seen the Father do. In the midst of this discussion of his discipling by the Father, note the backbone of discipling method is revealed. Jesus says, if you continue in my word as he did in his Father's, he implies, you are really my disciple. Verse 31b. Also, these very significant passages, John 3:32, 34, 5:19 and 20, and 30, for additional confirmation of this emphasis. In some way, not fully understood because of the mysteries surrounding the Trinity, the Son brought to his ministry such a replication of what the Father is like that he could say, whoever has seen me has seen the Father, like he does in John 4:9. In the context, Jesus makes it clear that his words and works are not only his, but the Father's, verse 10. This replication, leading to recognition of whose words and works were involved in Christ's ministry, leads to a powerful impetus for engaging in teaching by discipleship. The way in which the Son says that he learned from the Father, this basic theological thrust leads to a unique philosophy of education that Christians must exploit to the full. To do so would revolutionize Christian education from within and soon put it far ahead of secular education. Passages in Deuteronomy 6:4-9, 11:18-21, etc., that speak of teaching children only amplify the need for the whole person teaching whole persons in the life situation, out of the milieu context that is the bread and butter staple of discipleship. Counselors, then, must be aware of the opportunities that teaching by discipleship affords. They must see it as an essential element of counseling. Teaching and counseling are constantly spoken of together as two sides of the same sheet of paper. Colossians 1:28 and 3:16, they must learn the model truth in their own lives, often sharing experiences illustrative of biblical principles. But that is only one way to go. Perhaps the most vital first move they can make in the right direction is to enlist and train first their own disciples, a network of disciples, to whom they can refer counselees for discipling in specific areas. Pastors always ought to have on hand the names and numbers of a number of people equipped by them and willing to minister to counselees by allowing them to spend time with them. On the basis of Titus 2:4 and 5, for example, older mothers could take younger ones who are having various difficulties under their wing. Titus is told to arrange for this. That means you are to pastor a single person, perhaps with a bad family background, who is having difficulty understanding Christian living, very profitably could spend a couple of months living in the atmosphere of an exemplary Christian home, where he could observe, ask questions, and participate under the authority and discipline of the head of that home. The possibilities for good are all but limitless. Yet, with few exceptions, counselors have failed to develop and use this virtually untapped resource. It is time for pastors to set this trend in this, bringing, as the inevitable result, great blessings to all involved. The counselee can obtain greater help than if he only talked about his problem in the counseling room. The discipler will be blessed by giving of himself to the one he disciples. The pastor will be blessed with a ministering rather than frustrated and complaining congregation that frees him of much counseling that he ought not to do, to give greater attention to those persons whom he ought to minister to. All in all, then, I cannot recommend teaching by discipleship strongly enough. Indeed, I shouldn't recommend it at all. To be biblical, I must insist on it. Think about this. What part does discipleship training play in your ministry? The right answers to the question could revolutionize your entire ministry in short order. End of chapter 7.